Thank you for joining us on another episode of the Multipliers Podcast. I'll be your host for today. My name is Mehdi, and it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest, Ahmed Ismail, Professor of Geopolitics, Geoeconomics, and International Relations. Ahmed, thank you for joining me on today's episode.
Thank you, Mehdi. I'm happy that you invited me. Thank you for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be your guest today. Thank you.
It is our pleasure.
Thank you.
I've known you for a while, but can you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure, Mehdi, sure. So my name is Ahmed Ismail, 44 years old, lived half of my life in Lebanon and the other half exactly in France. That became my second home. I am married to Anastasia and I have two kids, Daniel and Maxime. Since my childhood, I was always passionate about history, politics, relations between countries, geography. So I had some passion that was a bit different than the passion of my other friends. And once I went to university, in the beginning I was already thinking to study political sciences or international relations. But then I finally followed the trend and I decided to do business administration. When I talk about the trend, 22 years ago, actually even more, 26 years ago when I went to university, we always thought that if you become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, or if you do business administration,
typical Arab parents.
Exactly, you will get a good job and good money.
Yeah.
And that was the thought back then.
Yeah.
So finally I did business administration. I don't regret it. I went to the American University of Beirut. I did a degree in business administration. And then I went to Grenoble.
Which year did you graduate?
2002. We were the same.
Yeah, I graduated as well.
You did?
Yeah, business. I'm not
AUB?
kidding. AUB?
ولا؟
Yeah.
حياة.
Oh my God.
No. ولا حياة. ما في غير حياة كان.
Man, this is so
كيف
odd.
التقينا؟ Mehdi, we were at the same school. We never met.
Wow, what a small world. This is incredible.
Dr. Osman.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Dr. Guchetarian.
Oui, Guchetarian, oui. Statistics.
Statistics, yes, of course. And
we had the same professors.
Everybody who graduated from AUB had to go
pass
through the Guchetarian. It was impossible.
Yes,
Otherwise,
yes.
you would have never graduated.
I'm really surprised.
That's
we never
crazy.
talked about this.
No. We probably even took a class or two together.
I have a feeling like this, Mehdi, seriously.
Yes, this is how podcasts bring people together.
Mehdi, you used to be a colleague.
Yeah, we used to be classmates without even knowing.
Most probably, yes.
Yeah, okay.
So
sorry, yes. Sorry.
It's a pleasure to know this.
Tangent back into Grenoble, sorry, you were saying?
To Grenoble. I went to Grenoble in France.
Okay.
And I did a master's degree in international business in Grenoble Graduate School of Business.
Okay.
And after that, I started working in sales and marketing, first in computer-aided translation tools to sell them to translators, to translation agencies, to corporations. So the market was in France and Western Europe mainly. Later on, I worked in telecommunications. I became a managing director and head of sales of a telecom company. In Paris, it was part of a Lebanese group, international one, based in Africa and the US and Lebanon and France. So it was, we were selling voice over IP services and equipment. So for quite a long time, for around 11 or 12 years, I worked in this business in sales and management. And then in 2014, we discussed with the current CEO of Multiply Group, Sami Abu Azza. We were discussing the problem of Russia and Ukraine. 2014, and the beginning of the Ukrainian Revolution, and when there was Russia annexed Crimea, and there was a separatist problem in Donetsk and Donbass region of Ukraine. So that was the beginning of a big story that, as we are seeing now, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict.
So it's been like a decade now.
Exactly. So 10 years ago, exactly, we decided with Samia to work together because she was interested in knowing the influence of such events, what we call geopolitical events and tensions and conflicts, on the business environment, on companies that want to invest, how it can impact their investments. That was the main idea in her head. And actually, 10 years later, we see ourselves, Mahdi, in a world full of conflicts, geopolitical tensions that we are going to talk about now. And we see that corporations now, more than ever probably, are in need of knowing what kind of influence, of impact, whether negative or sometimes positive impact on their own business, such conflicts can produce.
I think this will be like a good starting point of our conversation.
Exactly.
So, what is geopolitics, and how does it affect us? How does it affect businesses making decisions?
Mahdi, there are many definitions of geopolitics. What we can do is to say it in the simplest way for our audience. Geopolitics is, generally speaking, let's say, the consequences or the impact of geographic influence on power plays in international relations. It's geography and politics mixed together. And when we say geography, it means territory, it means natural resources, it means people, it means access to resources, access to the sea, access to technology, the Industrial Revolution, and so on. So it covers many, many topics. Even the climate change. Now, it's also covered by geopolitical tensions. I mean, it's you see them even in this topic. So geopolitics is when you see two nations or two blocks or more vying for influence over a territory, over even a people, over resources. And you can see a lot of tensions, such as the Russian-American tensions, Russian-Western tensions, Chinese-Western tensions. Geopolitics as a word was coined around maybe 124 years ago, in 1900 exactly. That was the first time we used the word geopolitics. But it doesn't mean it didn't exist for centuries and centuries. Even Aristotle and Montesquieu talked about the influence of geography on politics. So this is exactly the influence of geography on politics. And we have several schools of geopolitics, but what we can say is that since the Second World War, we did not witness that huge number of political tensions between nations, between alliances and blocs. We did not feel the threat of reaching a global conflict over a number of issues like we felt dozens of years ago. Even during the Cold War, we had some kind of unwritten rules that the two blocs, the Soviet bloc, the Communist bloc, and the Western bloc led by the US, did not directly confront each other. They were having confrontations through other countries. They would provide proxies, exactly. So the Vietnam War is an example. The Korea War is an example.
Civil War in Lebanon
is an example, of course. And we can go on with many other conflicts.
Iraq, Iran,
many wars in Africa, revolutions also. So the US was sometimes financing and arming some, let's say, rebel groups against the government. Soviet Union was doing the same in other places. Afghanistan war also, for example. So we had many conflicts, but they were kind of always controlled. But what we reached, especially since 2022, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is increased tensions that risked, and they still put the world at risk of a full-scale war, a world war, a third world war. We were already talking about a nuclear war. And the idea here, when we talk about geopolitics, we also move to another topic, which is geoeconomics. Sometimes people wonder what is geopolitics and what is geoeconomics. Actually, geoeconomics is when governments use economic tools, sometimes we can call them geoeconomic tools, to advance geopolitical objectives or goals. So in order to increase the influence of a country or to decrease the influence of another country, let's say, Some countries decide to use geoeconomic tools such as sanctions, trade barriers, increase in tariffs,
Restrictions on
technology control, tech transfer control, exactly, technology transfer, and so on. This is what we call geoeconomic tools. So that's why the relation between geoeconomics and geopolitics is very, very linked. And myself, Mahdi, as you introduced me, I work as a consultant, and I also teach courses in geopolitics in ESCA Business School in the Paris campus. So there, I'm teaching courses that sometimes you wonder, like you cannot see clearly the relation between geopolitics and such topics. For example, the geopolitics of climate change. Some people would wonder, how is geopolitics related to climate change? But in reality, we have many things to talk about in this topic. We have the COP conferences, like the one that Dubai hosted back in December.
Last year.
Back in December, yes, last year. This is the Conference of Parties. We have actually all the countries of the world meeting to try to find solutions to reduce the increase in temperature and the risk of climate change, and to mitigate or to adapt to those risks. So the idea, when we talk about geopolitics of climate change, we talk about how some countries also use their own capacities to exert more and more influence. Developed countries such as the US, for example, they are so far, since the Industrial Revolution, since 1850 till now, by volume of emissions, GHG, the greenhouse emissions, the highest emitters of GHG is the United States. The second place, we can find China already, Russia, Brazil, and Indonesia. Why do we have Brazil and Indonesia? Because they cut the forests. So this is the reason. And so the idea is you have developed countries that they got industrialized by also emitting a lot of carbon. And then you have other countries that we call emerging economies or developing economies, such as China, such as India, and other countries that want also to become industrialized and more developed. And they say it's not fair. So we are talking about the climate justice also, that they say it's not fair to us that you are putting limits on how much we have to emit. Nevertheless, even those countries are doing some efforts that are very important. Let's take the example of China itself. China is the number one producer of the world in solar panels. For example, this helps in energy transition. Also, they are doing, their energy transition in their own economy is faster than any country in the whole world. And even this is creating more tensions, because by producing such tools, such equipment, they were accused by the European Union and the United States of subsidizing their own companies and then dumping the markets of the EU and the US. That's why it created the trade wars.
Yeah, but that's kind of like technically like a difference between a country that has, let's say, a centralized government, right? That identifies certain trends, that identifies certain business sectors that are going to be booming. And based on those, they would direct the natural resources of the country or the labor market to focus on this. So we've been hearing the drums of climate change for over a decade. And the Chinese were smart enough to redeploy a lot of the excess resources that they have into this direction, which is why the PVCs that come out of China are not just effective, but they're also significantly cheaper than anywhere else. So
exactly. Mahdi, the West or Western countries, let's say the US and the EU, don't see in the same eye like we see it in this, because it's impacting their own industries, because their industries are not being able to compete with the Chinese industries, especially this solar panel industry or even electric vehicle industry now. So we can speak about many industries that are directly related to energy transition.
Whatever happened to free trade?
Exactly. We will reach this point, because it's related to what we call decoupling and de-risking with China. I will explain step by step, not to accelerate the steps, Mehdi.
Sure.
In 2018,
Yes.
actually, the solar panel issue, when Chinese were selling in the US, this issue prompted the Trump administration, among other issues, to say that you are risking the very existence of our own industries. So it pushed Trump back then to launch what we call the trade war against China by imposing high tariffs on a large number of Chinese goods. I think they targeted around $300 or $350 billion worth of imports from China with tariffs.
Just want to ask you a question about this in particular,
Sure,
because it was the Obama administration that actually started. They didn't start, it started decades before, but they really made a huge push towards globalization, and everything should be produced in China because it's cheaper, it's more effective, and then we just start consuming stuff. So is it so this shift from Obama to Trump, was it like an administration shift, or is it a shift, a calculated shift by the American, let's say business community that saw the detriment to the economy, and then that's why Make America
Great Again,
and all those slogans, and bring back jobs.
Economic nationalism, protectionism. Yes. Mehdi, very interesting question. Obama and even the administrations before Obama, even for a long time, in the 1980s, China started to open up step by step to the West. They wanted to attract investments. They wanted to open up. So they created a system that was a mix of capitalism and socialism. So it's a capitalist socialism or a socialist capitalism. You can call it either way. So Chinese were attracting FDIs, foreign direct investments, more and more from Japan and later on from the US and so on. Let's see the ideas behind those investments in China. One of the ideas, the West was thinking that by investing heavily in China, they might be able to push the Chinese government to change from, let's say, their own description as an authoritarian government to a more democratic government. They thought, we will invest a lot, they will become like us, kind of part of the West. That was the main idea. And actually, they failed in this. They invested a lot. The size of their investments, I think it reached around $1,000 billion of real FDI. And China took advantage of this to develop its own industries, sometimes in the beginning by reverse engineering, and later on by also producing. They learned from Western technology, and they produced, and they outproduced them by volume and sometimes by quality.
Absolutely.
So the idea, when the US started seeing that China was going to surpass it, economically speaking, actually, just one point on this, China already surpassed the US. If you calculate based on the purchasing power parity GDP, they already surpassed it. So they became already the number one economic power in the world.
Wow.
But when we talk about the nominal GDP, it's still the US. Yeah. So they are worried about it, because when you surpass the US economically speaking, you'll become even more attractive to other countries. You'll have more allies, more partners. I mean, as we see, the US has dozens and dozens of allies that always vote with the US, always follow the US lead, because of the US economic power that led to technological power and to a military power, and so on with the influence. So if China manages to surpass the US, of course, it will also gain its own part of allies. So the US does not wish China to become the next, superpower, like the equivalent of the former Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did not have the economic power as the Chinese one, but they had the military power. And by letting China become more developed and stronger economically, they are creating a giant superpower to compete with them.
Hence the decoupling.
Exactly. So that's why they started with some notion that was called a decoupling, which had a very negative meaning, very negative. Even, to the Chinese ears, it was a term that they did not like at all. The term was not officially adopted, let's say. But when we say decoupling, it's just the contrary of coupling. You are separating a couple. And then the West, especially, let's say, the Europeans, and by this I can cite, for example, the president of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. She used the word de-risking to, let's say, weaken the impact of the word decoupling. So de-risking means you are diversifying the risks. So you don't want to separate totally from your partner. This is not the goal, but the goal is to protect your own interest by finding additional partners, not partners that replace you totally, but additional ones to reduce the risk, to reduce the risk of supply chain problems like we had also. We'll talk about it, what we witnessed after COVID crisis, for example. And they are worried about China's power. So Western countries such as the EU bloc and the United States and other allies decided to try to find alternatives to China, while keeping China as an investment. As a place for their investment, but they were reducing step by step.
Who could it be?
Who
could it be?
This is the big question. Some suggested India. Okay, India has the size of China in terms of population. However, India, there are several factors that would prevent India from being the next China, such as, first, India lacks the infrastructure that China built with experience and with time, especially the infrastructure that international corporations need for producing there and exporting there. So they are building it, but they are still far from the Chinese infrastructure. This is one. In logistics, in terms of logistics also, and high tech. Second, you have, for example, the literacy rate in India. It's lower than the Chinese literacy rate. The percentage of women labor in India is much lower than the Chinese women labor. And we can go on with other factors.
Natural resources.
And natural resources, yes, it's a point also. But I think maybe the focus on the social factors is, and the infrastructure is the one that
prevented. It's more prevalent in India.
Yes.
Okay.
And then there is another factor. Would you replace China with another China? Would you create another giant? So you learned the lesson. You created a new giant. When we say you created a giant, of course, the Chinese way of governing their country, they knew how to use the opportunities that they got. But if you invest a lot in India and only in India instead of China, you will also provide India with a lot of technology. Indians also will learn like Chinese learned fast, and then they will keep on asking for a bigger role on the international arena.
It's an interesting perspective. So instead of having one big China, we're going to have
multiple China.
Small Chinas.
And this will lead us to the question of BRICS. We'll talk about also BRICS, because what's the common factor between the BRICS countries? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And then we will add the new members now.
Yeah.
We have the five of the original members were BRIC, BRIC before the S. And I don't know if many people don't know who who created the term BRICS. It's a British economist.
An economist. Okay.
Yes. And he was even a minister, I think Minister of Treasury in Britain. He worked for Goldman Sachs. And in one of his articles, I think it was back in 2001, a very long time ago, he talked about, the role of those nations in the global economy, if you invest there and so on. And he called it the BRIC. Later on, it became a real intergovernmental organization. And South Africa joined them. That was in 2009. It was created in Yekaterinburg in Russia. It was the first official meeting under this name. And then 2010, South Africa joined them. And then the latest addition, that was starting January 2024, we had 6 countries were invited. We had Saudi Arabia, the UAE, from Asia, and Iran, also the neighbor, Ethiopia and Egypt from Africa, and Argentina from South America. When Milei reached power in Argentina, he rejected the invitation.
It's pro-West, yeah.
Yes. And then we had 5 other countries. 4 of them accepted the invitation officially and clearly, which are the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia. And each of them was chosen for a specific reason. We'll talk about this. And then Saudi Arabia, although it did not officially really say that we are a member of the BRICS Plus, the expanded BRICS, which is the geopolitical foe of the G7, according to some analysis, Saudi Arabia is participating in the meetings. And I think we should be looking forward to the next summit of BRICS in October, in 1.5 months, in Russia, in Kazan. If Saudi Arabia sends
and delegation
leadership to be there, we'll understand, because several countries confirmed that Saudi Arabia is already a member, but there is some confusion about it.
Actually, more than this, I think it was in June when this whole petrodollar thing stopped, if I'm not mistaken, right?
We cannot yet say it stopped, Mehdi. The idea is about de-dollarization. We reach this thing. If you allow me, I wanted to add one more point, because you asked me before, who can replace China? I talked about India, but I did not mention the other ones.
Yes.
I just wanted to clarify this point. There is a list of dozens of countries, maybe up to 40 countries, depends on the sources, that can be alternatives, the plural alternatives to India. Among them, you can have Vietnam, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, Morocco, Mexico, and so on. All those countries can and are already receiving investments from companies some of them are leaving China. Several companies are reducing their presence. They are leaving because they want to diversify and they don't want to remain in China. They are worried about the tensions, the geopolitical tensions between the West and China. They are worried that China might put more restrictions, or their own governments might put more restrictions on them also. So they are trying to leave China, even step by step. But one of the very famous examples of how difficult also to leave China is the example of Apple. I think there was a study that showed that in order to repatriate or to move around 10% of the investments of Apple in China to, let's say, to India or another country, it might take up to 8 years. Like, there was a figure that was unbelievable, that how difficult to leave China and to invest in other countries.
One thing that I constantly say on the podcast is Rome wasn't built in a day. And the de-risking or the decoupling from China is not going to be done overnight. It's a process, because hundreds of billions of dollars were invested in the infrastructure by a lot of global companies, and they already have a lot of working plans there. So for them to shift all of those somewhere else isn't just about money and infrastructure. It's also about expertise. So, which is why TSMC has, is the biggest and is the best manufacturer of semiconductors globally. To go back to one question about China, what have they learned from the current de-risking, and what can they do about it?
When we talk about the de-risking between the West and China, the Chinese are learning from, let's say, the experience of Russia. The energy security of Europe. Russia was number one provider to Europe, to the EU countries, of energy. So number one in crude oil, number one in natural gas, number one in solid coal, and what else? I mean, every single type of energy that Europe needed, the Russians came in the first place. At some period of time, they almost covered 40% of Europe's need of natural gas. And this goes back to a very long time ago, when Western nations in Europe and the Soviet Union, they kind of needed each other. They found an understanding that we export to you the gas that you need. That's why the German economy flourished back then, because of the cheap prices. And The West will provide the Soviet Union with foreign currency, hard currency, and technology. And by having this equilibrium, Soviets did not invade Western Europe as they thought they would do. They did not go into a confrontation. So the idea, China is learning from what happened when Russia and the EU almost, it's not totally cut, almost cut their energy relations. They learned from the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy. They learned that Western nations, if they want to confiscate your sovereign assets, they can do it fast, which happened with Russia. While you have more than 300 billion, maybe 300, 350 billion of dollars of Russian sovereign assets were frozen quickly by Western nations after Russia invaded Ukraine. And even the assets of Russian businessmen, up to $50 billion of them, were also frozen. So the Chinese are observing this to learn from the lesson, like what could happen if there would be a conflict between China and Taiwan, because China has in mind to claim back Taiwan. And for a little explanation on this topic, Mehdi, many people don't know the history of Taiwan. They just know that there is a country called Taiwan, but what is really Taiwan?
Chinese Taipei.
Yes, but this is the name that they call them in the Olympics.
Yeah.
Actually, when there was the Communist Revolution with Mao Zedong in China, and when they won against Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader of China, the China of today, the followers of and the supporters of Chiang Kai-shek ran away to this island, which is part of the big China. And they created a China, I mean, the nationalist China, let's say there, or the Republic of China. They call it the Republic of China, I think. And then you have the People's Republic of China in
China.
of Beijing. So that's why you had two Chinas. And at some period of time, the countries of the world needed to choose which China they recognize. And there is a huge game now because only 12 nations around the world, only 12 recognize Taiwan as an independent country. They used to be 13 until a few months ago when there were the Taiwanese presidential elections. Once the pro-independence president won, Nauru decided to stop recognizing Taiwan as independent and withdrew it. So now you have only 12 nations recognizing it. So the idea, Chinese are anticipating if there will be a conflict with China, with Taiwan, and in consequence, if they will have a conflict with Western nations that could defend Taiwan, how can they manage things? Are they ready? This is a question. Do they want a conflict? This is another question, because they also have huge investment in U.S. Treasury bonds, as we know, hundreds of billions of dollars. Lately, they have been reducing them more and more. They are trying to protect themselves, but they don't want to lose all those investments that they came there. They don't want to go into a military solution. At least this is the idea that they are trying to say, like, don't push for a military solution. Let's reunite with Taiwan peacefully. So the Chinese learned from the Russian lessons in the war with Ukraine, what happened in the relations with the West. The Chinese learned that they have to rely on themselves even more than before. And they cannot, the partnership that they have with the West will go on. And we cannot know until how far it will go on. But they need to replace the technology that the West is providing to them with locally made technologies. And here we come to the issue of semiconductors, microelectronics. Because even if the Chinese produce them locally, but they don't produce the best one of them, where they are produced in Taiwan mainly by TSMC.
Yes.
So the Chinese are trying to replace the Western technology. The West or the US is forbidding some countries like the Netherlands, or like, let's say, cooperating with the Netherlands, with South Korea and Japan, not to send equipment to help China manufacture higher-end semiconductors in China. So China understands that need to do what we call the import substitution program. So even if they produce practically everything, they have also to go one more step further and produce higher-end electronics by themselves. So this is kind of the lessons. And one last lesson I would cite is that we have what we call the global south. Also, many people are not very familiar with this concept. We always talk about the West. The West, it doesn't mean geographically nations only located in the West.
The equator.
Yes, but we also, Australia is also part of the West. Japan also, South Korea, and so on.
Yes.
But it's nations that have in common precise, let's say, values, precise interests, in alliance with the US. And the global south mainly covers the nations that are in the southern hemisphere of the earth. And then China can be put as part of them or can be put as an ally of them. Russia, which is in the north, can be put as a partner in many topics, many things with the global south. Not part officially, but so the global south does not only cover poor countries, but also part of the global south nations are rich nations, rich with natural resources and advanced economies, such as the UAE, such as Saudi Arabia. So several of those nations also want their own place in the new international order. They don't want to just listen to, okay, the US believes this, the US recommends this, or the EU recommends this or believes this. They also want to play their role, which corresponds to the size of their economies, to the size of their own influence, regionally or internationally. Keep in mind, once the war in Ukraine started, there was some pressure on oil-producing countries or energy-producing countries to increase the supply to compensate for the Russian supply. But they refused. Not only they refused, but in the context of OPEC Plus mechanism, just to explain what is OPEC Plus, we have OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum-Producing Nations, which produces, which has Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Iraq, Iran, and so on among its members. So among many of the biggest producers of oil, they had an agreement with Russia and few other countries also producing oil to create what we call a OPEC Plus mechanism, where those countries, so the bloc OPEC plus other countries partners, cooperate to decide how much supply they should decrease or increase on the market depending on the price of oil, how to help increase the price of oil when needed. So Western countries got afraid after the conflict in Ukraine, and they started looking to diversify even more their energy sources, and they asked several of those countries to supply more. They refused because it was not in their national interest to do it. That was also a message that there are more and more nations that are playing a stronger role in the world geopolitics and international relations.
Did prices go up in Europe?
Sorry, at some period of time, yes, they went up. And even there was, later on, they managed to calm things down because they started receiving more US LNG, for example.
Yes.
And they started looking for more, and they started asking a campaign to ask citizens to consume less. And even this impacted, the prices impacted businesses. We saw many businesses in Germany went bankrupt. Sorry. So at some period of time, the French President Macron even talked to his US and Norwegian colleagues, and he was wondering why they had to provide their own gas or LNG with a price 3 times or 4 times higher than the earlier price. He said, friends, don't do it. Friends don't do this to their friends. So the idea that showed that the impact was already not easy at some period of time. So yes, the energy security problem is something very, very important in the confrontation between countries. But then we are going to have even more problems coming because when we talk about the fossil, with the energy transition question, we are linking it to stop using fossil fuel step by step. And some countries said like maybe in 30 years we'll stop using it.
Larry Fink recently said, we're not going to stop using oil and gas for the next 60 to 70 years. It's unrealistic.
It's unrealistic. You
And
know,
if Larry Fink says it, I trust him.
yes, several goals were put and were unrealistic. Several of them, and sometimes countries realize this a little bit too late. The idea were also, for example, there is the hydrogen diplomacy, producing a blue or green hydrogen,
Yes.
clean hydrogen. Imagine, Mahdi, some countries are already appointing diplomats for hydrogen diplomacy in their own embassies abroad to negotiate with other countries how to create partnerships to produce it and to export it or to import it. Because if for now fossil fuel energy producers have a very important role in geopolitics thanks to their resources, imagine once the hydrogen or the renewable energy will replace the fossil fuel, even if in dozens of years, the countries that can produce the hydrogen, the green and the blue one, or solar energy in big volumes, or hydroelectricity, for example, or wind power,
Renewables.
those countries will have even a bigger weight because they will not need any longer in the very long future to import fossil fuel. They will themselves produce for their own needs and they can even export. So we will have a different kind of a geopolitical game. This is in the very far future after the fossil fuel energy period, the era will pass. We are far from this yet, but at some period of time it will come.
So in terms of like so we spoke about the whole energy transition and how the EU was relying on Russia for, let's say, 40% of their...
Up to 40% in natural gas, around 25% in crude oil. So yes, and then in solid coal also.
Solid coal. So what's happening right now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and how do you see it ending?
Mehdi, the Russia-Ukraine conflict is the bloodiest conflict that Europe witnessed since the Second World War. Mm-hmm. If we had the Bosnia conflict that used to be called the bloodiest one,
yes,
the Russia-Ukraine conflict, perhaps maybe we need to multiply the impact by many times. Yes. Relations between Russia and the West, they still exist, but at a very minimal level.
The United States still imports uranium from Russia.
Yes, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, only a few months ago, they voted a bill, I think, to kind of stop it. But until last year, for sure, they imported. And this is true. This is true. And for info, Mahdi, while many European corporations left the Russian market, we see some American companies, you can see some articles lately appeared in the Financial Times, are replacing them and sometimes even sending equipment in the gas and oil industry that are not supposed to be in Russia. Mm-hmm. And then we see, so this is the question, what will happen? Russians created an import substitution program, which means they will try as much as possible to produce locally many of the equipment or goods that they used to import from the West. If they cannot produce them locally, and until gaining this knowledge how to do it, they will import it from what they call the friendly countries.
Yes.
And when we talk about friendly countries, then we can talk about Russia turning east, which means Russia now turning more to its Asian neighbors, especially China, because South Korea used to be a close commercial partner to Russia, but it took a stance against Russia with the sanctions. So Russia now can rely more on China. Russia is cooperating closely also with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, and then on the military level, for example, they are cooperating closely with the Iranians who helped them with some technology in the war. There is an exchange of military assistance. On the North Koreans, also exchange of military assistance. So one of the impacts of this war is Russia is separating and accelerating level with the West. It's decoupling with the West, let's call it like this. Russians would say, you started it. They would accuse the West because they would say that we tried to have this energy security to Europe. We conserved it for dozens of years, even during the Soviet Union era, all passed fine. But later on with time, I mean, the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines.
We don't have to mention who destroyed them because it's public knowledge now.
Exactly. So. But I will not
let's not address that.
Yes. So the idea is that, you see, I mean, Russia really, in their opinion, they tried to keep those relations. But now with all the weapons, financial assistance that the West is providing to Ukraine, Russia is weighing more and more its options. You know, Putin, for example, for a very long number of years, was always calling or addressing Western leaders as our partners. He never used, let's say, derogatory words. While the last 2-3 years, even some Western leaders were calling him, all kinds of words, which was for him unacceptable. So the idea is, yes, Russia is turning to the east. China is also learning that it needs to have more partners out of the Western world. So this is among the impact of what happened. And one more point I would add, Mehdi, is the food security impact. Food security. Russia and Ukraine together, they export almost around one third of the world's grain exports, wheat and so on, and corn and other grains. When Russia imposed a blockade on the Black Sea because of weapons, transports and so on, we had the problems. Some problems appeared in some African countries that relied always on Russian and Ukrainian exports of wheat. So the food security problem is also an issue. And this is pushing more and more countries to realize that we have to be very careful. We have to create programs for our national food security to be sure that we have to at least cover, let's say, 80% of our needs per year. Otherwise, they can face famine because of wars between other nations.
So how will it end? How will the conflict end?
How will the conflict end? This is a very open question. So far, what we are seeing on the battlefield is that we are seeing what we call an attrition war of attrition, which means the side which has more resources or patience will end up winning. We are seeing that Russia managed to advance on the field lately, and Ukraine is facing some manpower and equipment problems. If former President Trump wins the next elections, we can say there is maybe a higher chance of finding a solution through negotiations, because he's been saying that he can solve the issue very fast. That doesn't mean it might be solved quickly, but we already saw examples of how Republicans in the Congress blocked military assistance from the US to Ukraine for a very long time. So the idea, if he comes, negotiations will be more likely. Russians are betting on him if he wins. And again, that does not guarantee that he will solve it quickly, especially that he was the first one to start providing Ukraine with weapons. Not as the Biden administration, but he also started it. So most likely, at some moment, the two sides will have to sit on a negotiation table, forced by their own partners. And I think by partners, maybe the Western partners, which might put more and more pressure that we cannot keep on financing the Ukrainian economy forever. We cannot do this.
This is what the EU is currently doing. They're starting to
say we will limit it.
Exactly.
There are contradicting signs.
So this is the start of, let's say, the end of the war. Once your partners who you were relying on to finance you are starting to close the tap a bit.
Mehdi, we would say logically yes, but then we see when they have the big meetings of the G7 meeting, for example, the last meeting in Italy, or the NATO 75th anniversary summit in Washington lately. Those meetings took place in the last 2 months. In those meetings, the very same partners who are, let's say, becoming more and more bored with this conflict or suffering the economic consequences of the conflict, they are starting to claim to let's decrease the assistance. Nevertheless, in the G7 summit meeting and the NATO summit, they committed extra money assistance to Ukraine. So if we are going to count on this assistance to dry up, it's not going to happen at least for the next 6 months, 9 months, at least for probably the next 1 year. No, it's not going to dry up. But yes, we are seeing this tiredness of work in Western countries. It might be helpful. And then we are seeing also Russia, which is advancing on the military front, which is also can put pressure to finally end this before reaching a nuclear war.
God forbid.
Yes, because the risk is there. It's not high, but it is there. I mean, we can cite examples that prove it. The Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine itself, which is occupied by Russians, it was targeted at many times by shelling, by drones. And imagine if it can create a disaster. Then we see the Ukrainian incursion, or we can call it also invasion inside Russia. They took almost 1,000 square kilometers. This is another story, like how it will develop, because for the Russians, they are not really worried about it. They think it's something very light. It's not very important. So the Kursk nuclear power plant in Russia is in this region also. And some analysts were worried that maybe Ukraine wanted to advance as much as possible in the Russian territory and try to target it there. Okay, this is their own analysis. I mean, we cannot take side in this thing, but the idea is the risk of a nuclear disaster is there. The risk of a country using what we call tactical nuclear arms, which is nuclear arms, but on a smaller scale, is there. But then we heard a lot of talk of China putting pressure on Russia not to use it at all. So I certainly hope it will not come, but the risk, whether in Russia-Ukraine issue is there, North Korea, South Korea is there. So, yeah.
What is it with humans and this love of destruction?
You know, it's very hard. Probably this is the hardest question to ever answer. We can't. Why? Why do they always need to be in conflict?
Throughout human history.
Always conflicts.
Always.
You know, Mehdi, working in geopolitics and geoeconomics, you know, this is a thrilling era for people who work in this field, because we never witnessed so many, you know, interesting stories or conflicts or tensions from this geopolitical perspective. But of course, it's frightening. I mean, you know, it's a field which we never saw that many tensions in the whole world. China US or China West, Russia West, and so on and so on. It's interesting to see it, to analyze it, but it's also very scary to see where can we go.
And you were talking about like the use of tactical nuclear weapons, something which 10 years ago nobody had heard of, at least the public. And now in the recent conflicts, we're seeing the use of drones more and more and more. And I'm going to assume that artificial intelligence is going to have to play a role in the development of new arms and technologies. Where are we heading?
Or controlling them. This is even worse. Developing is something and controlling. Even Elon Musk. Yeah. I do remember last year, he issued, together with hundreds of scientists and experts, a letter to regulate artificial intelligence, because just imagine the scenario. You know, I think many of us watched the movie Terminator.
Yes, of course.
You know, when the machine takes control, right?
Yeah.
Skynet, exactly. So imagine if artificial intelligence takes control of a military facility that can launch nuclear weapons, or a nuclear power plant. Imagine this: if we put our destiny in the hand of a machine, not even a machine, you know, artificial intelligence, very intelligent machine. So it's very worrying. Then you talked also, you mentioned the question of drones. Mehdi, imagine the war in Ukraine now is the war where the drones were used. I mean, never any war witnessed the use of drones that much. Can you imagine that there is a specific type of drones called the FPV, first-person use drones, where you have only an operator controlling a drone through a remote control and a camera or a screen, and then putting a little explosive on the drone and then targeting the enemy. Imagine that both Russia and Ukraine this year are expected, each of them, to produce up to 1.5 million FPV drones this year alone. 1.5 million each of them to use it in this battlefield.
That's insane.
Insane. 1.5 million. We're not talking 110,000. Imagine for every present soldier on the front, probably you have around 2 drones, maybe, or 3 drones that can follow him to try to.
It's just like playing a game.
Yes. And you have schools of drone operators now. It became a trend. I mean, the drone operators for filming it's something, and drone operators and especially using the FPVs and in such fields, it's unbelievable. Like we saw horror scenes from the war there.
Of course.
And then, of course, you have the drones that can go 1,000 kilometers, 2,000 kilometers, and hitting facilities away, passing the air defense. And we are seeing more and more technology. I wish this technology was used for the good.
For the greater good, exactly.
Yes, we cannot but regret what's happening. But it's not the calmest era. That we are living in. It's really worrying
compared to other eras, because every era has had its craziness, and so compared to other eras, let's say from the 60s. 60s, 70s. So is this like the wildest, you think?
I think yes. I do think yes. I'm very convinced on this. Back then, Mehdi, okay, we can also compare a little bit. Of course, in some wars, we had human casualties that are very important back then, and we didn't hear about them. This is true. But at the same time, now we have the social media. Even some people are having fun to watch such videos and uploading this side or the other side. With all the technology we're having and with all this artificial intelligence that is coming, I think, it is a very, very wild era and a very dangerous one. So let's just hope that our leaders around the world will have the wisdom to stop this madness. Otherwise, we are heading to many disasters.
I hope so. Ahmed, we have a tradition at the end of the podcast, but I've cheated, by the way. I'm just speaking to our producer, Nihal.
Yes.
Because I came up with a new question. She doesn't know about it, and you don't know about it, so you'll be the first. So if you had the chance to go back to your 16-year-old self, okay, what advice would you give him?
Personally, I would have changed what degree of university degree I would have picked up in the beginning. I did business administration. I did the master's in this. And later on, I did a master's in strategic studies and defense and security policies. But I would have preferred to start directly with political sciences or international relations because it's my passion. I learned a lot from the business administration, business world, management and sales. I learned a lot. And of course, they are helping me a lot when we talk about geoeconomic tools to learn how they do it. Because I was importing and exporting some equipment, and I saw how some countries we cannot export to for specific reasons, such as those geoeconomic tools. But I feel that many years of my life, I would have been living my passion even more. Probably I lost a few years of my life to live fully my passion. Now I'm extremely happy. Since 10 years, I'm fully living it. And that's the only thing I would have changed. That's the only thing.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Mehdi.
God bless. And I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks a lot, Mehdi, for hosting me. Thanks to Anu and Nihal. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode. Until the next time.